Helen Pringle is an associate professor in the School of Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, with experience and expertise in research and teaching in the areas of human rights and of violence and discrimination against women. She is co-founder and co-convenor of the Nordic Model Information Network, a global network of researchers on the prostitution system. She acknowledges that she lives and works on unceded land, and here in particular acknowledges the wrongs and sorrows of a long history of sexual violence and exploitation of Indigenous women, which scars this land, but is yet to be fully and truthfully understood as a part of the Australian genocide. So, Helen, I would like to offer the floor to Helen Pringle.
Just please excuse me, I do have a bit of a cough from the aftermath of the flu, so I hope it won't be disturbing. What I want to talk about today, and Janet has emphasised to me the importance of showing that there is something you can do, or that we can do, rather, I should say. And I think that's so important, is just because in this topic in particular that I'm going to talk about, people often get very defeatist and think that there's nothing that they can do against the money and the might of the sex industry and of the prostitution system in particular. So the title of what I was going to talk about is the question of Me Too. And in terms of Me Too, I'm going to be talking about the importance of leaving no woman behind in addressing sexual assault. I want to say also that how important I think it is that we do some other things than trans. And by that, I don't mean to be rude to anybody or to myself, but so often, I'm sure you and I can speak for myself very clearly, get caught up in our emotional energy and in our passion and in our dreams as well, I think, and in our imagination with questions about the threat of trans, which is real and which is urgent and which is so important. But I also want to say, don't forget about the other things. And the other thing that I want to talk about is the prostitution system. And I think in particular, I want to stress this at this time because it's a propitious moment for us. Some of the stars are in an alignment, or whatever is in alignment is there for us at this time, and we just need to move quickly. And if we do, I think we can change things. I was hopeful that the others might speak about prostitution as a proposed change of the national government in New Zealand. Is there? And I don't know if there's any sign of that, but that would be my question as well. No. In Australia at the moment, and it's on the 29th, a bill will be voted on in the South Australian Legislative Council about introducing a form of the Nordic model. And there's a lot of work being done by people there, which is really promising, I think, at least. So my central recommendation, a la Janet, concerns the necessity of explicitly including prostitution in any consideration of the framework of sexual assault laws in Australia. And so there are two main changes I want to emphasise, two main short-term changes, and the long-term change is, of course, the abolition of the prostitution system. In terms of considering prostitution within the framework of sexual assault laws in Australia, which are currently in a state of flux and change, and promising flux and promising change, this would involve understanding the prostitution system within a human rights framework as a form of gender inequality, as a form of violence and coercion against women in particular, and of sexual exploitation. If we define or confine the examination of consent such that it leaves behind those women who are most at risk of systemic sexual assault and who are most in danger of their wrong and injuries being ignored, and in many cases mocked. If we do that, we've left people behind. We've left our sisters behind. And here at this point, I need to note that this is part of a project that Simone Watson and I are doing together, and we hope a couple of more people would come in as well. I've talked to those people, one of those people already, so we will hopefully that will come along. But it does involve an opportunity, a great opportunity for everyone who's listening here to put in a submission to the 2024 report of the Special Rapporteur Rim Al-Salem to the General Assembly, and she will be talking about prostitution and exploitation. And she is, if I could put it in such a crude way, she's on our side, and we should be on hers, but solidly on our side. And she gets into trouble for it quite a bit. So in terms of the work that Simone and I have done, we argue that a comprehensive and systematic rethinking of sexual assault laws in terms of human rights principles, particularly those of dignity and anti-discrimination, must address the question of consent and of coercion in prostitution. In New South Wales, where I live, in Sydney, the state of New South Wales, the recent changes were made last year, 2022, to the Crimes Act, in particular the provisions concerning affirmative consent. We think that they're a good beginning. However, we don't think that they're a good place to end up. We argue for a shift in how sexual assault is framed in legal provisions so as to bring their interpretation into line with an overarching definition of sexual assault as this, which is adapted from Catherine McKinnon. We say sexual assault should be defined as a violation of a sexual nature under circumstances of threat or use of force, fraud, coercion, abduction, or of the abuse of power, trust, or a position of dependency or vulnerability. In making that definition, Catherine McKinnon draws on the language and the reasoning of international law on sexual assault developed in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, for Rwanda, and the International Criminal Court, as well as on the language of the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress and Punish Trafficking in Persons, which is known as the Palermo Protocol. In part, I hope you're not yawning at this point. I know many people do yawn when the law is mentioned, and I think it's really important to remember that the law, if we don't understand and know the law, we are on a back foot in this area of sexual assault and of prostitution. It's so important that people know what the law says and how the law is interpreted. And I mean by that women know that. Men should know it too. But survivors, we think that mutual affirmative consent in addressing sexual assault is a good thing, but we think that the understanding and recognition of free consent should be not only a matter of actions and words between individuals, so do you want to have sex, etc., but we must also acknowledge the background conditions within which sexual power and preferences are formed, and in particular the way in which women as a class are marked as vulnerable and at risk, and in which some women are culturally and socially designated with a status of legitimately accessible to male sexual entitlement. And those women who are culturally and socially designated with the status of being accessible 24/7 is women in prostitution. Survivors of prostitution have drawn attention to the very fictive character of the consent that's often involved as underlying prostitution. So agreement on payment for sex can't be considered as free consent because it does not displace the coercive context of the prostitution system in which individual transactions take place. In the case of prostitution, money or other forms of payment form the initial and framing coercive element. What's purchased in transactions in prostitution is not sex, and it's not consent, but what's purchased is the suspension of a woman's desire not to consent. And that is one of the basic forms of coercion. So we see the problem of sexual consent achieved by payment, and in particular payment within the global prostitution system, as a blind spot in popular and academic discussions of sexual consent. When Simone and I made a submission to the government's inquiry on consent, our submission was number 65, and the following submission, number 66, was written by Grace Tame, who's a very famous campaigner on sexual assault and abuse in Australia. She didn't mention prostitution once, and as far as I know, not one of the submissions to the Commonwealth inquiry mentioned this as posing a particular problem. The cultural blind spot in understanding the prostitution system as coercive can be deadly for women. and for women in particular in prostitution. A good case or good example is that of Henry Jiang. Mr. Jiang, I'll just tell his story briefly. He was a real estate agent, and I'll ask you for your verdict when I finish. He was a real estate agent who broke into a vacant house and paid an escort agency, as they're called here, for a woman to come there. At the end of the hour that he'd paid for, in which he experienced sexual impotence, incapacity, the woman made as if to leave, but he blocked her. He put a sponge in her mouth and, content warning here, he bound her across the face and by the hands with electrical cable. The woman alleged that Jiang then vaginally, anally, and digitally, anally and orally raped her, performed unprotected oral sex on her, and indecently assaulted her. He also took her wallet and her mobile and threw them away. She finally escaped without her clothes from the house, with the police having to use bolt cutters to release her bound hands. The magistrate, the initial magistrate, refused bail to Mr. Jiang on the basis of what the magistrate characterised as sustained torture and brutal rape. He refused to give bail to Mr. Jiang because of the high level of what he called torture here, actual torture. The magistrate refused bail on the basis of what can be of the torture, but Jiang's defence was that there was consent to the whole encounter. So he was charged with 8 charges of false imprisonment and sexual assault and of theft. He pleaded guilty to a separate charge of theft in the course of a dispute over drugs, and that was the subject of another trial. If you could just think to yourself, I don't think it'll be a mystery to you about how many of those 7 charges of false imprisonment he was found guilty of. There's, of course, none. When he was tried, he was found guilty of the theft of the purse and the mobile, and was sentenced in a separate trial on that. The judge in that case suggested, very ironically and sarcastically, that the jury members in the previous case had seemingly made their decision on the basis that Jiang had paid for the woman, and that he was within his rights in seeking the completion of their mutual agreement. In Australia, as in other places, it is almost impossible to get a conviction for sexual assault of a woman in prostitution. And that applies not only in the course of prostitution, but also a woman who is in prostitution, but in her life that doesn't involve prostitution as well. It's not uncommon to get a prosecution and to get a successful prosecution against a man who physically assaults a woman in prostitution, beats her up, for example, either within the brothel or outside of the brothel, but your chances of getting a conviction on sexual assault are minimal. So we say here so it's really important that the jury also, every person that I'm speaking to is a potential member of a jury. Every person that I speak to about this question is a potential member of a jury. And it's really important that they know the law, that they're aware of what the law is, and that they're aware of what are the different sort of questions at issue here. In that case, the magistrate, the judge, the police all thought that this was a case of torture. They didn't think that there was any doubt and that Mr. Jiang would go down, if you like, but he walked. We say that a system of payment for sex constructs a framework of coercion and consent, which overrides any particular expressions of consent, but the very conditions of free consent. So this form of systemic coercion is exacerbated by the highly gendered nature of the prostitution system as a network of asymmetrical relationships between prostituted women and buyers and pimps. On the one hand, the extreme vulnerability of women, with on the other hand, an extreme form of male entitlement to access women's bodies. Any discussion of sexual consent that doesn't comprehensively include the prostitution system in its deliberations remains seriously incomplete. We know that there is a widespread cultural illusion of the distinctness of sex in prostitution from normal sex, as it's often called, which both reflects and reinforces the illusion of the distinctness of women in prostitution from other women. We refuse to embed such a distinction into consideration of the legal or cultural status of sexual assault. If we maintain that distinction as is maintained in New Zealand law and most Australian state laws, that distinction would mean leaving behind those women most vulnerable to sexual assault, that is, vulnerable to continual and approved systemic rape in prostitution. Most people we find are against rape, but they simply don't recognise what happens in prostitution as rape. We also know that a change in law, I've been stressing law, but we know that a change in law can't single-handedly or immediately transform entrenched social, cultural and economic practices and institutions. But if you think of the law not only as punitive, as punishing, but also as permissive, it hands out, I've said this before in other contexts, it's like they hand out a card to men, all men, and not all men use this card, but they hand out a card to men, all men, saying, women in prostitution are accessible to you. It's a form of entitlement, of giving them permission to exercise their entitlement and to approve certain categories of entitlement, male entitlement. Law is also a form of sex education. In the words of the legislation in New South Wales, for example, it's that's explicit there, that the conduct of trials and the words of judges and the decisions of juries tell tales and convey ideas about love and justice, which powerfully shape our perspectives and values of what's acceptable and reasonable in our intimate lives. So what I want to suggest is that there are two short-term recommendations that we should go for, and that these are some of the things maybe that you could recommend to the special rapporteur. The first is an explicit clarification in all legal statements on sexual assault that a person accused of sexual assault or rape, we use the term sexual assault in New South Wales to cover a variety of abuses, that any person accused of sexual assault can't rely on a consent achieved by payment of a monetary sum or in the course of a commercial transaction. They cannot rely on an achieved consent by payment as a defence in any way. And the second thing that we wanted to do is to say in the short term is to put forward an explicit legal formulation of a civil action for sexual assault committed in the context of the prostitution system and associated forms of exploitation, whether it involves direct commission or complicity in the act by pimps, for example. This proposal takes as its model the state of Illinois in America has what is called a Predator Accountability Act, little used but available to use against sexual predation, particularly in the sex industry and the prostitution system. Just to finish up here, so when we make explicit in this way the objective of the law on sexual assault and how we do that is important in setting out our values and our boundaries and teaching people about what sexual assault is and what prostitution is and why it's a harmful practice to women. I think the UN doesn't call it a harmful traditional practice, but I don't see why we can't. We note, because it's been there for so long and we're always told that it's going to be there forever, that it's inevitable. In the New South Wales legislation, ongoing and mutual communication can't by definition be accomplished where a partner to the act is unconscious. So we want to say that ongoing and mutual communication can't be by definition be accomplished where a partner to the act is paid for in that way. We don't think that the sexual assault laws should specify a degree of enthusiasm. Some people have said that they think that there should be enthusiastic consent. We don't believe that that it's the role of law or culture to investigate and monitor levels of enthusiasm in sexual acts, and to require this of sexual partners when there are much better ways to talk about coercion and consent in the criminal law. What we suggest is that just as there are provisions in the New South Wales law that state certain conditions under which sexual consent is impossible or is presumed to be impossible, like intoxication, for example, we also need this a provision that talks about prostitution in the context of, and sexual assault, both in the context of coercion as well as in the context of consent. We think, Simone and I think, that the pendulum has swung the other way too far in terms of an emphasis on consent, and not enough emphasis on the conditions of coercion under which so much sex takes place, so much normal sex as well as non-normal prostitution sex, to be sarcastic, that so much of that takes place under conditions of background conditions of coercion. So what we say is that we should disqualify any reliance on consent within the prostitution system. I've had people who say to me, doesn't that make prostitution impossible? What man would buy a woman if he can't rely on the consent that he's purchased by money? And the answer is, of course, obvious, which is yes, of course. That's the whole point. And that's it. So the point is to make it so that it is impossible to continue to believe that prostitution is an institution worth saving in any form, regulated or unregulated. So the ultimate aim is, of course, the abolition, and to make that something that is imaginable, and make it something that's possible, instead of with most people you talk to. I think the idea is, well, and I've spoken to a lot of people, including my mother, who said to me, gee, that's a good idea. Why didn't people think about that before? And then her second line was, yeah, but it will never work. And my mother didn't say that out of any kind of malice towards women in prostitution, but simply out of the difficulty of imagining something like that. And so putting something on our imaginative horizons is something that we can do as well, thinking that this might be something that is worthwhile, really worthwhile, not only for those in prostitution, but for women in general, and that it's actually possible, I hope, in my lifetime, but certainly in the lifetime of my son. So those are the two proposals that we put forward, and to recognise, as I say again, the importance of a context of coercion in structuring not only sexual assault in general, but in particular sexual assault in prostitution. So I'd have to talk I have to have another 20 minutes, which I obviously don't have. I'd have to talk about why the conditions of coercion in prostitution more broadly, but I think that leaves it for now. So that so the two things that I recommend are imagine that it's possible, imagine that it's worthwhile, that it's possible, and second, I'll put in the chat the web address for the submissions for Reem Al-Salem, the special rapporteur. I'll do that now. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. I think that was really informative and helpful and inspiring.